Instructional Designers in Offices Drinking Coffee is brought to you by Domino, makers of Domino One, the cloud-based authoring tool for e-learning. Learn how your team can work together better at domino.com. Now, here's this week's episode.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Special effects. Sparing no expense. Here we are again, everyone. It's Wednesday. We're having a good time. Wednesday of the new season. Still feels like summer where I live, but, you know, I know it's fall for everybody else. How's everybody doing in the chat? Looks like we got the weather reports rolling in fast today. Didn't even have to ask today, Chris. This is fantastic.
It's remarkable how weather brings us together. It's a common thing in all of our lives. Here, the temperature is a steady 21 degrees Celsius because that's what the thermostat is set to. That's my weather, indoor weather report.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Well, we're having another fantastic day with another fantastic guest today, Chris. Who's hanging out with us today?
Folks, we are very glad to have Tim Slade joining us again. Tim, you've been with us a couple of times, but there are probably folks that are joining us today that haven't met you or don't even know who you are. So share your background, your bio, whatever you want.
Yeah, so I work as a freelance e-learning designer, and I've been doing that for about 15 years now, which is crazy. And when I'm not helping clients design and develop custom e-learning solutions, I also run the E-Learning Designers Academy, which is an online program community to help new e-learning designers learn how to design e-learning.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Very nice.
And today we're talking about storyboarding. Before we jump into that, Brent did set up a poll question. So if you've got a heartbeat there, folks, maybe jump in and toss your thoughts or make a selection in the poll. Give us some data, gosh darn it. Yeah, I mean, everybody does storyboarding maybe a little bit differently. Everybody comes at it for different purposes. We typically think of it kind of as a blueprint, right? Or the thing that's going to be created. A way to kind of pin everything down before we actually start spending time on the making, process, etc. Does that jive with how you view a storyboard, Tim?
Yeah, the thing I always tell people is a storyboard, kind of like what you said, is like a blueprint for a house, right? You wouldn't, if you're building a house, you probably wouldn't just go to the Home Depot and grab a bunch of supplies and start building the house. You'd want to know what you're going to build before you build it, right? Especially if you're building that house for somebody else. You want them to have input on what you're going to build and how it's going to be laid out, because if you just, go straight into the construction process and then the client decides they want to move the kitchen, that might mean rebuilding the house. And so the same applies to e-learning, right? Well, whatever tool you're using, you want to have a common understanding of what you're covering in the course and how it's going to be structured before you build it, right? So it's like a blueprint for a house. Yeah.
And kind of like a blueprint too, it's got to go through some approvals, right? House building, oh gosh, there's permits and things involved and sign-offs and engineering structural stuff to make sure that it's all going to be safe. So, not dissimilarly, the folks that you're doing something for, whether you're a freelancer, like yourself, or working internally with a team, you do need that sign-off and that paperwork aspect of things, the approval to say that, yep, this is what we're going to do.
Well, yeah, just like a house, right? A house has to be inspected by different folks from the city, or it has to be inspected by, obviously, a homeowner. And the same thing is true with the e-learning, right? You shouldn't, at least ideally, you shouldn't be designing your e-learning in a vacuum. You have stakeholders who need to review it and subject matter experts who need to review it. Maybe a legal team needs to review it. And so in addition to just helping you construct, to go along with the house building analogy, right? To help you construct your e-learning course, Storyboard's also a communication tool, right? It allows you to review it, and it gives something that's easily editable by somebody who doesn't have your e-learning authoring tool, a way to review it and edit it and comment on it, again, before you start building the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are some steps, I guess, before storyboarding. Obviously, we have to do some, there are other aspects of our instructional design before we can actually get to it. And I typically think, depending on how people approach a storyboard, sometimes it's, a strongly kind of visual thing, with, layouts and such. And sometimes folks just use, particularly what I've seen, something if the content they're going to make is kind of fairly template based, then they're maybe working in a Word or other, kind of text-based document, and just providing info with descriptions of, what the visuals are going to be. How do you typically approach putting a storyboard together?
One of the things that I often debate, and I still debate, and I'd love to know what everyone else thinks in chat, and I'd love to know what you two think. I often go back and forth on whether or not storyboarding is part of the design. If you think of like ADDIE, analysis, design, development, so forth and so on. I debate whether or not storyboarding is part of the design process or part of the development process. And lately I've leaned more towards it being part of the development process, because the design process, to your point, you need to do your needs analysis. You need to determine what sort of interventions you're creating, whether that's e-learning or something else, or a combination of the two. You're collecting content, sorting through it, removing nice to know information. And the reason I view storyboarding as part of the development process, and I know Kevin Thorne's here, so I'll be curious to know what Kevin has to say, because he's passionate about this topic too, is I view storyboarding on the same spectrum as prototyping, where storyboarding is a low fidelity version of maybe a prototype, and then you get into higher fidelity versions of your course. And so for me, the lowest fidelity version of a storyboard you might create is like an outline of your course, right? Something with sticky notes with arrows drawn between them. And then you might have a written storyboard and a visual storyboard. And you might just create one of those things. You don't have to create all three of them, but then you kind of move, you think of a visual storyboard, that's getting into a higher level of fidelity. You're kind of seeing the slides, how they might be visualized, even if you're just using, placeholder images or simple shapes. Then you get into prototyping, which is on kind of the higher side, higher level of fidelity of that spectrum, where you have visual prototypes or functional prototypes, or what I call an MVP prototype, which is like a full sampling of your course. And so I think storyboarding is part of the development process, and it's, you view these things on a spectrum of fidelity, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and it kind of also depends on the type of content that you are creating. Simpler things could be outlined. Simpler content presentation options could be outlined with less effort, for instance, in a storyboard, where something that is more complex, etc., starts getting into the nitty-gritty of taking perhaps stylus to tablet and providing actual visual type pieces, as opposed to just described layouts and that sort of a thing.
Or even whether or not there's interactivity. You might be creating a non-interactive digital course. Maybe it's just a video, right? When I do storyboarding for videos, those are typically way simpler than if I'm creating something or storyboarding for something that's going to be highly interactive, right? And so that gets into, what do you actually put in your storyboard? I guess to your point, it depends on the nature of what you're building, the complexity of it.
Yeah, sometimes if we're building a shed rather than a house, we can just get the plans quickly from the hardware store. But if it's a custom house and you're working with an architect, the level of stuff that you need to do is a little bit more
totally
involved on that front. So
absolutely, for sure.
And Lance has tossed in a thought that just a simple statement: iterative design and development. Of course, it's never a one and done, is it? I mean, it's your chance to start. It's really a continuation of a conversation between you and either your client or your internal client or the SMEs or the stakeholders, etc. There's definitely a back and forth to this process for sure.
Yeah, there should be, right? Like I said earlier, you don't want to design and develop these things in a vacuum. And so I think there's a whole camp of people out there who would tell you storyboarding is a waste of time. But I found that if I can spend a lot of time iterating on a storyboard with not just myself, but with my stakeholders or my subject matter experts, if I can iterate a lot on that, then it makes the development process so much easier, because ideally, by the time you do get to development, there's no surprises about what that course is going to include or how it's going to flow. At that point, you're really just then debate. Hopefully, you're just debating look and feel at that point, or maybe some functionality. But I feel like the more time you spend storyboarding, the less time you're going to spend redoing work in the development process, which takes, in my opinion, way more time.
Certainly costs time and effort to undo things and then have to redo them or alter them, et cetera. So the goal is to have agreement and move forward as clearly as possible. And the storyboarding, like you were mentioning, it gives you a chance too to work out, especially if something is complex. You've got branching related things, you might discover problems then, et cetera. Or, oh, didn't think of this, we better resolve that now before it becomes an issue later on as well.
Yeah. And well, then that storyboard too also becomes really useful in the interactivity of it. So when you get that storyboard and even if it's just written, I think you probably put in some visuals to a certain extent, but then you give that to the developer has to be thinking in their mind, okay, how am I going to code this, right? Even if it's just something really simple, they may need to be thinking to themselves, okay, I'm going to need a couple new variables, right, that I need to put in here to track what it is that they're doing on this screen or whatever. And they're going to have to storyboard that anyways to say, okay, kind of sketch it out in their mind. The person clicks here, it does this. If they click here instead, then what happens? I'm going to need to track whether they clicked this instead of that. So I'm going to have a variable for that. And they're going to need to think it through. And so when you're storyboarding ahead of time as a designer, you're helping them along the process too and making their job a little bit easier.
Well, you bring up a really great point that I don't feel like we talk enough about when we're talking about storyboarding is you just referenced handing a storyboard off to a developer. And a lot of instructional designers, maybe they're just doing everything from A to Z. They're storyboarding their own courses, but other teams, other organizations operate in a way where there's people who do the storyboarding and then they hand it off to a developer to build it. And so when you think about the importance of the level of detail you need to have in a storyboard, just like the level of importance you need in a blueprint, it's so important that it's clearly understood by a third party. And so one of the things I'm always striving for with my storyboards, and I encourage this of everybody, even if you're doing your own development, is you want to strive for what I call a development ready storyboard, meaning it has such a level of detail that you could theoretically hand it off to another person who had no involvement in the creation of that storyboard. Just like a blueprint has such a level of detail that a construction team could build that house with never interacting with the architect, that you could build that course, because you never know when you might be working on a team where you're just doing the storyboarding and you're handing it off to somebody else. And so all that information is so important so that somebody could theoretically build that course if that's the team you're working on or the type of team you're working on.
Yeah, Richard has a great question in the chat. He says, do you storyboard your support materials and activities as well as the primary subject matter? And that's something that I don't think I've really thought about, because in this day and age, we are creating more than just e-learning courses per se, right? I mean, it's a lot of what we do. Then we add the support material and all that kind of stuff. How does that fit into it?
I don't. Assuming when we talk about when Richard says support materials and activities, if we're talking about things that are happening outside of the e-learning course, no, I don't storyboard those. The reason we focus so much on storyboarding, not that we don't outline them or something, I'll talk about that in a moment, but the reason storyboarding for e-learning goes into so much more detail than you might go into when outlining other types of training deliverables is that e-learning is a form of digital interactive multimedia. And you think about an interactive e-learning course that you might build in any particular tool, you might have audio narration, you might have animations, you're going to have interactivity, you're going to have visuals on the screen. Like, there's a lot happening in the communication of your content. And so you want to storyboard it so that you're understanding how that piece of multimedia is going to come together. As it relates to other types of supplemental materials, let's say you're also creating a job aid with your course, or maybe following the course, they're going to get a job aid and they're going to do some sort of activity. You might include that as part of your design document. Usually what I do when I'm designing a blended experience is I will create a design document, which is like a very high level view of the entire strategy. It'll say something like, we're going to have an e-learning course and it's going to cover these objectives. And then there's a job aid covering these objectives and an activity covering these objectives. I'll usually include that there, but I probably won't go into the level of extent of storyboarding that I would with a e-learning course. Because, a job aid, if I need to edit a job aid, it's not going to be detrimental for me to create that job aid and go back and edit it later because it's just some work. It's on a page, right? Whereas it might be detrimental to go back and edit this e-learning course after you've created the whole thing. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. That's a great question though, Richard.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about maybe developing a curriculum or an ecosystem, right? Part of that instructional design phase, or if you're more of a consultant or you're a strategist with an organization and you're actually helping them kind of rethink and rebuild their whole learning strategy as a whole, I think that picture that you draw for them might include, hey, we're gonna have this technology building these types of things over here. We're gonna have the support stuff over here. So that might be considered kind of storyboard-ish, as far as that high level solution that you're creating. And then within each one of those, you might have different levels of that storyboarding as well. It's just visual stuff, right? Just to kind of give people a visual as opposed to just words.
Yeah, well, like we were talking about before we went live, Brent, one of the things I think a lot of people, especially people who are new to the industry, is they get really stuck on trying to make sure they're storyboarding the right way or creating an outline the right way or a design document the right way. And one of the things that, people who are new to this industry or new to e-learning, one of the things you'll find really quickly is if you go out on LinkedIn and ask people, how would you define a storyboard? You ask 10 people, you're going to get probably 15 different answers. And so there's no, I have my thoughts on the right way to storyboard, and people like Kevin has his own thoughts on storyboarding, and everyone has their own methodology. And at the end of the day, it's not about how you go about storyboarding or outlining or creating a design document. It's about doing what's the best thing you can create that's going to help you move the project forward, where everyone's on the same page. And if you call that thing a storyboard, but it looks like, I don't know, a design document, fine, that's fine, as long as it helps you move the project forward.
Yeah, we get hung up on terms, don't we, in our industry?
Yeah.
And that, I think
we do.
that does scare a lot of newbies that come in. And it's like, well, apparently part of this process that I'm learning how to do, that I'm really excited about, has this element called storyboarding. So now I'm going to have to learn the right way to do it. And really, the right way is just whatever way you're comfortable doing that communicates the message of how you've decided this content, given to this particular audience, is going to function in this space, and it's going to be the best way to present this content to that particular set of end users in a particular environment, right? Are they on a mobile device? Are they on a laptop? Are most of them somewhere? Visually showing that is absolutely going to be critical. But I think you're right. I think the influx of so many new people into our industry, I think they do have a tendency to kind of overthink it.
Yeah, well, and in the 15 years I've been in this industry, I feel like collectively, as us in the industry, we've been on this endless journey of trying to figure out how we're all going to speak the same language. And as the tools we use change and evolve, that's never going to end. We're constantly trying to figure out how do we all speak the same language. And while I do think, despite what I said a moment ago about doing whatever it does you need to do to move the project forward, for the most part, with storyboarding, we're mostly speaking the same language. But I've seen storyboard formats that are completely different than the way I create storyboards or the way somebody else creates storyboards. And so, at the end of the day, no particular person's definition of a storyboard is the right one. It's whatever helps you move forward in the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kevin had a neat phrasing referring to in the chat here. A storyboard workbook is a collection of several companion documents, a video or photo shot list, if needed, audio script, scenario map, style guide, photo board, etc. So that's a pretty involved.
I like that. I like that term.
supplements and those sorts of things. And I guess the complexity of that's obviously going to be a reflection of, if you don't have video, you're not going to shoot any video, so you don't need to include that kind of a thing. Cindy's also commenting in the chat, I find that combining storyboarding and experience mapping helps document the supporting activities and supplemental materials. So kind of like some of that description feels to me almost like the storyboard's becoming kind of a prototype. You're kind of working through it and then revealing things that other things that might need to still be considered.
Yep. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's all of those efforts are moving towards, I keep using the word fidelity, right? You're moving from lower versions of fidelity to higher versions of fidelity, higher levels of detail to your course. And I love the idea of the storyboard workbook. I mean, one of the things I like to include in my storyboards, especially with courses that are non-linear, where you have branching, is I'll start that storyboard off with like a map of the course, so that somebody with the slide numbers, so that whoever's reviewing it can kind of visualize, slide 2.2 is down way over here, and it's not related to where slide 3.3 is at, or whatever the case might be. And so, what elements or artifacts you include, I guess, depends on the complexity of what you're creating.
Yeah, I've done some branching projects, and one of them in particular was very, very elaborate, etc. And the storyboard was done in Word. So you have, choice go to, and that might be 3 pages later. So that really can get cumbersome in terms of, right, but now I got to go back here and reread, and even just picturing the pathways and that sort of a thing in that, in based on words, whereas something that is more chart based or visually based helps you at least follow through and figure out, and avoiding problems later on that don't get to. That can be headed off before you hand it over to the actual making process.
Yeah, totally. And I've seen, somebody, Christy Tucker, she references this tool a lot. Twine, I think it is. Twine is a great tool where you can create, you can map out something that's non-linear. And so, whenever I'm reading a storyboard where it's like jump to page 7, and then you're trying to play that mental gymnastics of then I got to go back to page 2 for the menu, and then so if you can create something that helps somebody visually navigate a non-linear course that's written in a linear fashion, I think that's always helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I asked this the other day. I think I asked it on Twitter. I'm not sure where I asked it now, but I asked, when all of that information came out about Adobe buying that prototyping tool, I started thinking to myself, Adobe already has XD, and I know some folks in our industry utilize that a lot, and I have heard of Twine. And so I started thinking to myself, does our industry need a prototyping tool like that, or do we already have prototyping kind of pseudo built into the authoring tools that we use, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a few instances where some companies or people have tried to create a storyboarding tool for e-learning, and I've never seen any of those really take off, because everyone, going back to we were saying earlier, everyone does it a little bit differently. So how do you create one tool that accounts for the way everybody does it? So a lot of times I've seen people, who will they'll usually use Adobe XD or Figma or any of those sorts of tools for visual prototyping, right? Which is kind of you might also storyboard in it as well. Some people will storyboard. This actually comes back to one of the poll questions. 11% of people said they vote in their authoring tool, or they storyboard in their authoring tool. And so, the only time I storyboard directly in the authoring tool is if it's a text-based authoring tool. If it's going to be there's not a lot of, animations or multimedia or branching. The reason I'm not a big fan of storyboarding directly in whatever tool I'm using is because most tools don't allow for collaboration, meaning, your stakeholder can't go in and edit it or comment on it in an easy way. And so I like to keep my storyboards in tools like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, where I can easily email it to them and they can open it up and comment and edit it on. But Adobe XD, Figma, Miro, all those tools allow us for really great online collaboration. So those are options as well.
Yeah, as Jan is pointing out in the chat, the problem with special storyboard tools is that the reviewers, may not have access to it.
Yeah.
So there's something definitely to be said to going, for working in this kind of thing in those kind of, let's call them universally available, formats, whether that's the office documents, that kind of a thing, because at least people are also familiar enough with it to be able to, work with it, etc. on their end.
Yeah.
You don't have to train someone to, or teach them how to use, a different tool. So.
I'm seeing somebody ask about wanting to see an example of a storyboard. Would you mind if I shared some real world storyboards?
Sure.
Let me pull up. I'm going to pull up two different versions. I'm going to show everybody a written storyboard and a visual storyboard for two real projects that I've worked on. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, I was going to say, it might be kind of cool because I know there's so many people in our industry that, at least the ones that speak up, maybe there aren't as many as I thought, but that suffer from that imposter syndrome, right? They think they're not creative. They think they're not creative. They think they don't have the skills to draw well enough to do a storyboard, and so they're going to have to hire somebody to do the storyboard and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things we've been trying to do with Drink and Draw with Kevin is, in a very fun way, help teach people how in our industry to do that kind of stuff on your own. And that, low fidelity drawings even stick people, as long as you can get that message across and communicate what it is you're trying to communicate to the team members, to the SMEs or whomever that needs to make the final decision. That's really all you need to do. You don't have to be a professional graphic illustrator or artist, in order to be able to do this. So it might be kind of fun too I think the show and tell is great so people can realize, oh, Tim, he's a super awesome professional, doing this all the time. And, he's doing, minimalistic art or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
So now
Absolutely.
I feel better about, my skill set.
Yeah. What are you drinking during these drink and draws? I'm curious.
It's just coffee.
Coffee.
Oh, that's boring.
Coffee.
I've been wanting to do a series of like drunk e-learning where we drink wine and design e-learning together. That would be fun. Okay.
Oh, that would be.
That would be, right? Yeah. So this is a good example of a pretty standard written storyboard. This was one I created for a client on accounting, a really interesting topic. And usually what I'll do at some point in the storyboard is I like to include some mention of the learning objectives. That way, whoever's reviewing it, or even if I'm writing it, I have a kind of my North Star of what's supposed to be covered in the course. And a written storyboard, like I said, you'll see these in many different formats, but they're usually a series of tables for each slide or screen. If it's going to have audio narration, that's outlined here. And then there's usually a cell for, outlining what the learner is going to see in terms of on-screen text or graphics. And then usually some form of technical note saying, the learner is going to click the begin button to start the course. Pretty simple. Whenever I use a written storyboard, I usually use written storyboards on courses that have audio narration, because that's really where most of the content's being delivered. And so it's a big focus on that. And I'll usually, when I'm outlining the graphics, I'll be pretty clear about what the on-screen text will be. But with graphics, I may not know exactly what I'm going to animate there, because usually I don't figure that out till I'm sitting in the tool animating it. So I'll usually keep it pretty vague. Like, it's going to be a graphic of a credit union animating in with various components. What does that mean? I don't know yet. I'll figure that out when I get into development. But that's not important right now because we're focusing in on the content, right? And so, you can see how this continues forward. And then we have an interactive slide here. So this is a clip to reveal. Here's some audio narration. And then there's going to be some pop-up windows here revealing, content. And so these are good when you want to focus yourself and your stakeholders and your subject matter experts on your content. You don't want them worrying too much about the look and feel at this point. And I'll explain why in this next example I'll show you. So that's a good example of a pretty standard written storyboard. I will tell you, if you've never done a storyboard before, doing your first storyboard can be very, very intense and overwhelming because, if let's say you're more accustomed to classroom facilitation, or you've designed content for in-person facilitation, you're probably not accustomed to literally scripting out every single word that's going to be mentioned in the course or in that workshop. You're not scripting out everything the facilitator's saying. You might list some bullet points. E-learning, on the other hand, especially with something like audio narration, you have to script it out. You have to literally document every single word, and that can be a huge lift for folks. So Written storyboards take a lot of work the first time. On the other hand, I'll show you an example of a visual storyboard. A visual storyboard I typically use when I'm creating courses that don't have audio narration, and courses that are text-based. The reason I usually do a visual storyboard for text-based courses is because when you create a text-based course, you have to be really cognizant of how much text you're putting on a given screen. And so usually I like to create a visual storyboard because it's kind of like a mock-up. It's kind of a hybrid between, a prototype and a storyboard. Usually when I create a storyboard like this, I'll usually include some notes. Like I'll tell, my stakeholders, this is a visual storyboard. Many of the slides include placeholder images and text. It's not meant to represent the final look and feel. Focus on the content. Make any edits directly in the content, right? And so this is a good example of a visual storyboard. They're usually very, very, very low fidelity. I'm using placeholder shapes to represent graphics. It shows where the text might be, simple shapes for buttons. The goal is, again, you want to focus on what's going to be on-screen content and, an idea of what's going to be placed there in terms of imagery. So you can see it's a placeholder. It's going to show positive and diverse workplace image or graphic, whatever that means. I'll figure that out in development. My only hiccup, I will say, with using a visual storyboard, and you can see here's a main menu. I'll show a couple more slides here. Here's a great example of like a scenario-based interaction where it shows the different options and the feedback. One thing you have to be careful about with a visual storyboard is that no matter how much you tell your stakeholders and subject matter experts, this is not meant to represent the final look and feel. No matter how much you drill that in their head, you're going to get feedback that's going to say, gosh, is that feedback going to be green and orange like that? Or is this really the image that's going to be there, a gray box? And so you have to overcome that hurdle with them to help them understand, no, this is not what the course is going to look like. We're working on just the content right now. And the layout of elements. So,
and that's one of the things that I find alters sometimes how you approach a storyboard. You realize starting to work with a client that they need more of that visual up front because that's becoming it's getting in the way of where you feel we should be but then, and I think of it in a way. I know some folks who can look at. There are folks who can look at blueprints for a house and they have a pretty good sense of how you're going to walk around that house. There are other folks as part of that the architecture process and the design process that the architect has to make a 3D model of, to be able to help people understand. Some folks just can't, some folks don't move well from flat to a sense of space based on a
So that's a great. You bring up a great point because a part of reviewing a storyboard is being able to visualize in your mind's eye what this might look like or what the experience might be. So in those instances, if I'm working with somebody who really just can't get over the hump that they can't visualize what they're seeing here beyond what they're seeing here, if that makes any sense, then what I'll do is I'll usually create like to accompany this like a 3-screen prototype. Like I'll create a couple of slides just so I can say like, hey, here's the storyboard, but here's what these 3 screens will look like once I fully develop them. So I'll usually deliver that to accompany it so they can at least give them comfort knowing, this is not what the main menu is really going to look like, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also too, I mean, for you are doing the next step, yourself, but there are folks who are in an organization where that's going to get handed off to somebody else who's actually going to do the making, including potentially, the visual designing. And there was a comment earlier about that kind of a process where there's, where there's a difference between the storyboarding and design piece, and then it's handed off to someone, to actually put it together and visually create it, and leaving at least some creative room for them to bring something, of themselves or their ideas, et cetera, to the project too, is another place where there is wiggle room, but definitely getting some often anyway, getting some visuals that people can picture the translation of this into something more complete is really often a hurdle or a challenge to
and the more you work with, whoever you're working with, whether it's a client or a group of stakeholders with an organization, the first time you work with them, that's always going to be the most painful. And then once they realize, oh yeah, Mr. and Mrs. Instructional Designer, they know what they're doing, that next storyboard, you won't have to do as much heavy lifting because they'll trust you, hopefully, that
yeah.
And
if you're, for you already know if you're going to be the maker post storyboard, you're already, answering in implicit questions in your own mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same as if you're working with a team within your own organization. The more familiar you are with the, say the designing team or whatever, you end up with shorthand, the ability to talk in shorthand,
right.
We're all on the same wavelength or whatever. But if there's an outside person, they don't know that wavelength. They don't know those implicit things either too. So that another layer to consider when you're storyboarding that you have.
And I think the worst thing, you can do as an instructional designer or an e-learning developer is work with a stakeholder or client and assume they have any idea what you're doing. You never want to assume. And so, a big part of whenever I do like a kickoff meeting, a big part of it is just, teaching them my language and explaining what a storyboard is. Or when you send off that storyboard, you need to tell them what is a storyboard and where does it fit in the development process and why doesn't it. Because if you don't, they're going to go, why? This doesn't look like an e-learning course that I've ever seen before. Well, because they don't know what a storyboard is. Or in their mind, a storyboard is, like what you see a movie storyboard looks like. So you have to define everything along the way.
Mm-hmm. And even sometimes I have to define what the breaks are between stages. In other words, once we sign off on the storyboard, there may be things that we have to do. If something has to be undone or changed or altered, that becomes costly. And maybe those are, depending on, if you're a contractor or whatever, et cetera, maybe you have the opportunity to at least have a contract that, includes something about author alterations after approvals and those sorts of things, because things past storyboard can cost time and money to change and alter. So if I'm creating a course, let's say that includes audio narration or maybe live action video, I just worked with a client where we did a bunch of live action video, and the on-screen talent, our actress, she said a word, I can't remember what the word was, but she mispronounced it ever so slightly where you would notice it. And the subject matter expert, my client, they gave me feedback. They're like, can we have her say it this way? And I'm like, if we want to go back and refilm it, I can't magically change what her mouth, I'm not like Pixar where I could do that, And so or if I'm going to do something that requires recording audio narration, one of the things that I've learned to do is I always have this meeting with my stakeholder to let them know, hey, we're recording audio narration, and anything that we have to change after this gets more costly, gets more timely. And so you want to make sure, do you really want to move forward here? Because the deeper you get in, the more costly it becomes, for sure. Yeah, I've definitely had some experiences where the narration comes back and, oh, that's not how we say that word. And so, you can identify technical terms, if it's, how do we pronounce this particular, chemical, or, what I mean? Those sorts of things. Sometimes those things are things that we can anticipate ahead and say, hey, give us a pronunciation on this. And then, maybe you can pass that on to the narration team. But I've definitely had some redos of audios when come back because the words were slightly off, regional dialects even sometimes.
And that's part of the learning process. We all go make those stupid mistakes before we realize, oh yeah, we need to start asking for pronunciation on certain things before we send it off for recording, right? Yeah.
I remember somebody told me, and I never forgot this. They equated it to concrete or cement, and how you build like a foundation, or how you work with something like cement, right? Like the further you get into the process, and the more solid it becomes, the more expensive and the more difficult it is to back yourself up.
That's so true.
Out of the process, because you get to a certain point. That means basically breaking the concrete, throwing it away, and starting from scratch, basically. But if you're still kind of at the mixing stage and you're still gathering all of the different components and you haven't quite put them into the wheelbarrow to start mixing it all up yet, you're still pretty good, right? You're still okay. You can still make some changes. Once the mix starts happening, now you're on kind of a time frame, and then once you start pouring it into the mold, you still have time to make some changes. You could reshape it a little bit before it hardens, but once it starts to harden, Now you're talking about really big, costly things to go back and start over. So it's
Yeah.
like the further you go down the process, the more expensive it is to have errors. So I think in general, the idea of storyboarding and scripting and all that kind of stuff ahead of time is to help eliminate the potential for needing to have
Yep.
those expensive backtracking moments.
Yep, and somebody, Kelly mentioned, prepping the stakeholders is so important. And if your stakeholders, in their mind, if we just empathize with where they're at, they say we need a course. In their mind, they don't understand initially why you can't just go away for 3 weeks and come back with a completed e-learning course. That's in their mind what's going to happen. And so that prepping, that analogy, I use the house building analogy or the concrete analogy. Every time I'm meeting with them the first time, that's what I'm explaining. This is why we're doing this, and this is why, of course, it seems, overkill, and it seems like we're spending so much time. But like I said, all that work you put on the front end is going to make development so much smoother.
I literally had somebody actually use the word "do your magic." We're gonna do all this stuff, and it's gonna take us a few weeks to get all our stuff together and to do all of our stuff, and then we're gonna send it to you, and then you go ahead and do your magic, and and then when you're done, send it back to us, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, time out.
Yeah.
We wave our magic instructional design wand and
Yeah. Right.
abraca addy, it's done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, what? You guys don't have a little bowl of instructional design fairy dust that you sprinkle on the PowerPoints and make it e-learning?
That's what they think.
And you've got to watch that fairy dust because it gets everywhere. The rest of your life, you're vacuuming up instructional design fairy dust off of every counter surface. It sticks.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what are those key points? If we had to tell anybody a brand new coming into this industry, Tim, what are some of the key tips and things that you'd like somebody to learn? Maybe give us like a top 2 or 3.
That a storyboard is like a blueprint for a house. And so you want to build a house without a blueprint. You shouldn't build an e-learning course without a storyboard. That it should include enough detail that you could theoretically hand it off to a third party and they could develop it. That's what it means to have a development ready storyboard. And that it's not really important the way you lay out your storyboard or what format or template you use. It's about doing whatever helps you move the project forward with a common understanding with whoever you're working with.
Perfect. Wow, that's the most succinct rundown I think we've had as we approach the end of an idiotic and need that music coming up. Tim, you're the greatest, man. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us on storyboarding today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Where can they find you?
Oh, I'll put some links in chat. Hold on. I wrote them down. I got a copy of them. Inside my free community, that's the e-learning designers community, and then connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll put those links in chat there.
And folks, as always, don't forget instructional designers in offices drinking coffee. #idiotic is brought to you by Domino Learning Systems, makers of Domino One. So when you've got that storyboard and you're ready to bring it to life, Domino One is a tool that can help you do that, including collaborating with your reviewers and other processes. There's a link in the chat if you want to check us out and learn a bit more about that. And maybe, Brent, we can throw in the Idiotic LinkedIn group link one more time too.
We absolutely can do
Got
that.
it.
Indeed. We've got more episodes coming up too. You guys can check us out on idiodc.com. Idiotic.com is a great place to see more.
Yep.
And
while you're here in Crowdcast too, just sign up for the next episode so you're
there you go.
You're all lined up.
They
Tim, thanks so
save
much
your
for joining
spot.
us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, always so much fun having you. Have a great day, folks.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Everybody get a cup of coffee and dance on out of here. Don't forget, Chris, you're the one that has to turn us off.
Oh yeah.
Bye.
Bye everybody. Have a great day, folks.
See you, Tim.